I'm just going to open, though, with the question, why is it so hard to share things? To really share. There can be such a long list of reasons why it's hard that I can't even begin to give you the whole list of why it's hard to share, and especially because it's different for each of us. But I would suggest to you that it boils down to fear that there's not enough of what we really want. There's not enough of the things that are most important to us. So I don't know what your list is. Maybe your biggest fear is sharing money. Maybe your biggest fear is sharing your time. Maybe it's sharing your heart and your life. All of those things can be difficult to share, and we don't all have the same challenges in each of those areas. It makes me wonder how we got here. Because I think if I asked each one of you, you would say you want to be a person who shares. Most people I know want to be that, whether they can easily be that or not. And something has often caused us to become the kind of people who decide we've got to protect something, and in order to protect something, you just don't share it. It might be something difficult in your past. It might be something like the dad who never wanted to come home, stayed working late every night, or maybe went to the golf course every chance he could, or maybe went to the bar at night, almost anything to keep from coming home. That can leave this empty spot in you that makes you want to start filling that empty spot with other things. I don't want to pick just on dads, and that's, it's a little bit stereotyped there, but we can work out from the stereotypes, right? Maybe it was a mom who wanted things so ordered and so clean in the home that you felt in your own house growing up that you were just a problem to be solved because of how messy you were. And even to this day, when you hear somebody say, no wire hangers, you just get a little uptight, that kind of thing. That kind of thing can leave a hole in us. Maybe it's something way more dark, way darker than that. If someone took advantage of you relationally when you were young, who didn't have the rights to do what that person did, from my conversations with people, nothing leaves an emptiness in us like that. It's an emptiness that we often try to fill with all sorts of things. Maybe it's more mundane than that. Maybe it's as simple as you see people having a great time on social media and you don't experience life that way, and so you start wanting that, and you just know that you're never going to have that beautiful life. Or maybe it's not social media because, that sort of thought was in our hearts long before social media became an issue. There are so many things in our lives that can make us suddenly afraid that there's just not enough to go around. And if there's not enough to go around, then I'm going to have to start collecting what I can and keep what I can in order to have enough. That's always a challenge for us. And once we decide on what some people call the scarcity narrative, once you decide that things are scarce, it changes how you think, how you live, and what you do. And so we wind up thinking, okay, I will share, but here's what I will share. I will share the things, if I may do a callback to a couple sermons ago, I will share the things that don't spark joy for me. If you give away the things that don't spark joy, that's not really sharing. That's getting rid of your trash. It's a different understanding of what's happening. So what happens, I've noticed with people, is we get this emptiness and we decide we can only share the things we don't want. And so what we share is the things that are bothering us. You may catch yourself doing, I catch myself doing this. You start talking to someone and you just complain about the things that are, you share your bad feelings. Maybe it's you share stories about your spouse who's not being very nice to you, or your children who aren't doing what you want them to do, or your boss, or whatever it is. You wind up being a person who goes around sharing the things that don't spark joy for you. And at the same time, you wind up trying to hoard to yourself things that give you hope, things that you do think will spark joy for you. So see how this works. I'm sharing this bad stuff, and I'm trying to bring in good stuff to fill that emptiness. And what we decide are things like, you know what really makes me spark joy? A new relationship. Man, the beginning of a romantic relationship is fantastic, right? And so you just keep having more and more new relationships, hoping to fill that spot, but the newness doesn't last, so you have to keep doing it. Is it any reason is any mystery why we wind up feeling lonely, if that's how we're going to live? Maybe we wind up, maybe it's not starting new relationships, we're not that brazen or bold or whatever that would be. Maybe it's just, you know what, I will spark joy if I just have another drink. I will spark joy if I can just find a show on Netflix that meets my needs. And what happens is we share the bad stuff and we try to hoard some good stuff to fill our hearts, but in the whole process, we wind up distancing ourselves from other people and winding up alone. I didn't expect when I began working on this sermon to wind up in the area of loneliness, but everything that I looked at just kept leading me to, if I wind up feeling empty and alone, it may be connected to my inability to share. This past year, just about a year ago, a study was released. It was done by a national insurance company that used a UCLA scale of loneliness on a sample size of 200,000 people, which if you're doing a study, 200,000 people is a huge study. And what they found in that study is that 54% of that sample size qualified as lonely. The results of the survey were that loneliness is now an epidemic in America. And by the way, the study also showed that those who participate more in social media report a higher level of loneliness than those who don't. I don't know if it's because of the social media or if it's our loneliness that drives us to social media. I don't know if it's causation or correlation, but that's what the study found. Former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General under President Obama, reported a study that said that loneliness was harder on your health in terms of lifespan than smoking 15 cigarettes a day and harder on your health than obesity. That's what a big problem loneliness is for us. And so when I wonder how we got to the non-sharing part, I wonder how much those two are related. And I think the answer is going to come to us from an unexpected source, which makes sense, doesn't it? That if we're going to find an answer to loneliness, if it's that pervasive in our culture, it's probably going to come from someplace we don't expect. Otherwise, more people wouldn't be lonely. I think it works out logically. So as we look at the text for today from 1 Timothy, just a reminder about some of what the letter of 1 Timothy is. It's a letter from the Apostle Paul to his understudy, so to speak, Timothy. I always want to say to his Timothy. It's such a common phrase in Christian culture to have someone you're mentoring and bringing along that you call that person a Timothy. Well, this is where that started. If you're not from the church, you may not know that, but that's some church language we use all the time. Who's your Timothy? That kind of thing. He's writing to Timothy because Timothy is in the church at Ephesus. We talked about the church of Ephesus last week. It was a large city. It was an important metropolitan city. And what we begin to see as we look at what they were dealing with, if you sit down and read 1 Timothy all in one, just straight through, you really get the sense, at least I really get the sense, that the church is now established. Paul helped get it going. Paul's gone away, and now he's hearing reports from the church. The church, once established, begins to drift. You just see that as an institution gets established and begins to grow, that it's harder and harder to keep it focused on the mission. So a lot of this letter to Timothy is Paul telling Timothy he's got to deal with some things in the church and help straighten out. He's worried about the doctrine, not because the doctrine hasn't been thought of at all, but because now they're starting to argue about things that aren't on mission. They're starting to worry about things like genealogies and just little stuff that doesn't matter that we can wind up talking about when we lose our focus on the mission of the church, which is to make disciples of all nations. That's the mission. And Paul sees that mission is drifting. He's worried about things like the way people are dressing when they come together, because some are dressing up to the nines and others don't have that kind of clothing, and it's hurting community. He's worried about things like who gets to be on the list of widows that the church supports. There's a long discussion on that. You just feel like Paul got a report from the church at Ephesus, and the report was problems. He's trying to get him to address that. And one of the other issues that he wants Timothy to address is that difference between people who have affluence in the church and the people who don't, because that can be a difficult thing for community when you have some people with a lot and some people with almost nothing. Remember, this is the book where Paul says that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. This is the book where the Apostle Paul says, hey, it's not uncommon for people to start focusing on money, and it pulls them away from the church, it pulls them away from God, and they drift off onto their own. So Paul is concerned about that problem as well as we come to this text. And Paul says to Timothy, I want you to address, toward the end of this book, I want you to address the wealthy people about greed. And if I'm Timothy, I want to say, gee, Paul, thanks. To Paul's credit, he says, I'm going to come along later and help, but I can't be there now. You need to address this. Of all the sins we have to deal with, the strange thing about the sin of greed is none of us thinks we're greedy. Not really. It's a sin that hides itself from our eyes. Tim Keller, the preacher in New York City, made the point that I really liked, because I found his experience to match mine. He said over the years he's had a lot of people come in and confess all sorts of sins. He said people come in and confess pornography addiction, people come in and confess extramarital affairs, all sorts of things, but never once has somebody come in and said, I confess that I'm greedy. And the reason, he says, is because it sneaks up on us and we don't really see it. He makes the wonderful point of why it's different, because as a man, if he's getting ready to have an affair, starts kissing a woman, doesn't go, oh, that's not my wife. I didn't even realize that wasn't my wife. That's what happens with greed. Is, oh, I didn't even realize that I was being greedy. So he says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, he begins to reach out and say, as for those who in this present age are rich, command them not to be haughty. Their money doesn't make them better than anybody else. They don't get to imagine they are somehow above other people. Command them not to set their hopes on the certainty of the riches. The money won't save you. The money may give you a little bit of protection here and now, but it doesn't give you protection in the long term. He goes on to say, rather, put your certainty on God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. I like that he puts that in there, that we have things to enjoy. It's not wrong to enjoy what we have, but where do you put your certainty and your hope? If it's on your things, it's going to be a problem. And then he tells Timothy to tell the rich that they are to do good, to be rich in good works. That includes generosity, be ready to share, thus storing up for themselves a treasure of a good foundation for the future. By sharing their good works, by sharing their stuff, by sharing their money, They are to be building a good foundation for the future. I think Paul's talking about the community that is the church there. They're to invest their lives in such a way that this community that is the church at Ephesus will go on and provide the gospel message for people in the future. And I love that last line, so that they may take hold of the life that is really life. So that they may take hold of the life that is really life. It's possible there, isn't it, that Paul wants Timothy to share this message about the rich to the rich for personal gain, isn't it? Because Paul looks good if the church does well and grows and shares with one another. It would be possible that Paul and Timothy both are not acting altruistically when they tell the church at Ephesus and they tell the wealthy people at the church of Ephesus, you need to share your good works, you need to share your money, you need to build a foundation for the future, for the sharing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That could be altruistic or it could be selfish, but I would contend that the Apostle Paul is doing that because he has seen Jesus Christ. All of that thought that you just heard, that's not a fundraising thought for the Apostle Paul. It is, how do our lives match the gift of Jesus Christ, who, instead of thinking equality with God as something to be grasped, emptied himself and shared himself, becoming obedient even to death on a cross, sharing the most precious gift of all, himself, with the world, and in so doing built a community of family for God. And I would add that he sees that God the Father gave to us the most precious gift God could, his Son. All of that is based on the very nature and character of God in Christ, and I think it suggests to us that what we need to be sharing is that which is most important to us. If you want to overcome loneliness, if you want to build a foundation for a community where people get along and love each other and build each other up, you do it by sharing your best stuff so that you don't lead in conversation with the things that are wrong. You lead in conversation with the things that God has given you that are a great blessing to you. You don't lead into relationships with your weakness. You lead with the things that God has given you that made you strong and the things that are special about you, and that's what you share. And you share the heart that God has given you, the love that God has given you, and you open it up and break it out and pour that gift on others, sharing the thing that you may be most afraid there's not enough of, but what you will find is that God replenishes that well. When I first started preaching, I would come across stories that I wanted to use, and I would think, that's a good story. I could use it this week, but I need to save a story for next week, because you're always worried about how quickly the Sundays come around, and it didn't take me long to realize you just got to give it everything you got every week and trust that God's going to fill it back up. Some weeks he has, and some weeks he hasn't. I'll let you be the judge by what kind of week this was. We are called to share that thing that is so precious to us, and it's not just as individuals. As we talk about planning this second site, it's a part of the church trying to match that same understanding of who God is. We want to share the best of who we are with others. And what that's going to mean is some of you are going to go to a second site and we're going to miss what we have here together that's so nice right now, but we just have to trust that God will fill it back up, because the way to overcome loneliness and lack of sharing is to share your best. To share your best. We have great things here at Grandview, and we're just going to break it open and trust that God's going to fill it back up. And we believe that that way forward matches the nature and character of the God we serve, who never quits giving those great gifts. What is most important to you? Are you willing to share that? Are you willing to break that gift open and allow it to become a part of the community? It might be your time, it might be your money, it might be your heart. What are you willing to share? And the question I would love for us to be able to answer with a yes is simply this: is the gospel of Jesus Christ the most important thing to us? Is the fact that God would share his son with us in order to save us the most important thing to us? And if it is, that's what we better be sharing. We're going to have to break our lives open sometimes in order to find the people we need to share it with and know them well enough to share that message. But this is the call of the church. And when we live up to it, I am 1,000% sure we will discover that the sharing life means more. Shall we pray?